Hello, thank you for joining this session of the 2021 Data for Policy Conference. My name is Nishant Anand. Today I'll be talking about the paper that was co-written by myself and Dr. Irina on responsible innovation for digital identity systems. This is manuscript number 34 within the conference. Our paper will focuses on three main areas. The first is on digital identities and digital identity systems and why they're relevant. The second area is how these systems are currently governed today and what issues exist in current governance mechanisms. And the third section focuses on our framework, which is by introducing responsible innovation methodology as a means for governing digital identity systems. So I'll start off with the first section, which is around digital identities. And what we've seen is that digital identity tends to be studied in a variety of academic disciplines, especially recently. They've been covered in 4 areas in particular. So computer science is focused on attribute propagation or data identifiers, understanding what data identifiers are needed in digital identity systems, what the inherent risks from a systems perspective are to manage these data identifiers and how they're managed and how the risk is mitigated. Secondly, sociological studies have focused on the digital self and how individuals experience themselves or experience their culture and environment through technology. The third area has been a focus of surveillance studies, and that have covered how digitalization creates infrastructure to categorize and monitor individuals. And the fourth area broadly has been innovation and development studies that have focused on the potential economic benefits that can be reaped from the use of systems reliant on digital identities. And there are a number of global, national, economic and social imperatives as to why digital identities or EIDs matter. As you may know, Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 16.9 made legal identity for all a target to achieve. And it's also been increasingly linked to the access to identity in general has been linked to access to services and participation in society. What we've seen is that that requirement for legal identity has been converted into digital identity projects that are being implemented in various nations. So legal identity is essentially converted into legal digital identities. Again, related to national imperatives, it is also, digital identities has also been linked with fixing welfare systems, improving public administration efficiency, and also providing a way to improve national security by managing migration. There are economic imperatives as new digital business models are beginning to be developed or continue to be developed. Additionally, existing businesses are increasingly converting their systems and processes to be more digitally enabled. And finally, from a social imperative perspective, we are also increasingly communicating with people we know, our culture, our society through digital mediums, and also increasingly spending time using digital technologies. And all of these imperatives really rely on systems of identification that ensure that the objectives of these imperatives are met, which is why digital identity systems become central to a lot of discourses. What we've seen in most literature and use cases has been that when we talk about digital identities or digital identity systems, they tend to either focus on the technological assemblage, which is essentially the technology used to create these systems, or specifically on the user's experiences when engaging with these systems or trying to engage with, for example, the government while using these systems. But these systems actually have a vast amount of interrelated parts that include not just the users, but also a number of different stakeholders. There are a number of unknown and unseen organizational processes. and a number of techno-commercial arrangements that are also enable identification and usage. So our focus on this paper has really been to appreciate the systems nature of digital identity systems and build a framework that enables governance of the system to ensure that there are beneficial outcomes for all stakeholders. So if we think of current governance approaches for digital identity systems, they tend to fall into three categories. The first is regulation, and within regulation, of course, there are data protection and privacy laws, competition and consumer protection laws. Organizational processes, so there are now an increasing number of data protection officers that are being put in place in companies, and there are also risk management processes and policies that companies have. And the third area is technology. So there are technology fixes that are being used to improve the privacy, or to increase the privacy for users, and also increase the security of these systems that are being used. But these current innovations or these current governance approaches also have their limitations. So even though I think 132 jurisdictions now have instituted data privacy laws, and the 28 more are still in draft. What we have seen is that in a number of jurisdictions, especially in the global south, the effectiveness of these laws are only as good as the implementation capacity of the nation. In India, for example, while the draft data protection bill is still being debated in parliament, and I think it's been debated for 3 years, enrollment in their national ID system, Aadhaar, has surpassed over 90% of the population. Even in the EU, so while GDPR provides comprehensive protection for individuals, the responsibility to actively manage personal data trails still lies on the data subject, who is often unaware of the risks that they've been exposed to or their data has been exposed to, or how they can exercise their digital rights. In terms of organizational processes, privacy policies tend to often be written in inaccessible languages. Consent is often overlooked in an international development setting, where actually showing up for registration is seen as consent in itself. Even in the EU, consent is only one of 6 data processing pathways that a company can use to actually use personal data. And finally, when it comes to organizational processes, companies tend to do cost-benefit analysis of when it comes to risk mitigation, which often only focuses on their organization and doesn't address the networked risk nature of these technologies. And in terms of the technology solutions that are being used, often there's an over-reliance on a small group of people to control complex systems that large groups of people rely on. And this kind of black box nature creates distrust, as people don't understand how their data is being used or managed or protected. And secondly, with technologies like the blockchain, which do offer quite a bit of promise, what happens when the data is wrong at the source? Or when it comes to biometrics, what happens when, since fingerprints don't change over life, what happens in the case of identity theft? So there are, while there are, of course, quite a few governance approaches or interventions for existing EID systems, there are also significant limitations. And really, the limitations in the current approaches can be boxed into 2 areas. So individual users have been left out of a lot of the conversations. So there's a lack of awareness, both in terms of the practices and policies and regulations and data rights that a user may have. Secondly, there's limited engagement both in the design and development of these systems. So users tend to not be involved or tend to not be brought into the design of these systems or the governance or management of these systems. And finally, in terms of control, so individuals normally feel like they either don't have power over their own digital identity or the practices that are being deployed to manage their digital identities. And what this tends to do is it limits trust What we've seen with engineering systems is that trust is often discussed as an engineering problem to be solved when it has distinct cognitive, emotional, and behavioral dimensions as well. So just by providing a technological solution may not help in actually improving the trust. There needs to be more transparency of data processing practices, and trust really needs to be developed through a two-way information flow to ensure individuals and organizations understand each other's requirements and limitations. So we've covered how digital identity systems are currently governed, what the potential risks or issues associated with these systems are, and what the limitations are. And what I'll do is I'll really quickly introduce the concept of responsible innovation, and then talk about how responsible innovation can be implemented within the context of digital identity system governance, and how we can create a framework that complements existing governance practices. So responsible innovation is built on the ideal of taking care of the future through collective stewardship of innovation in the present. And really what it is it's a set of principles that aren't meant to be prescriptive, but guidelines that should be used and considered when managing emerging technology. Essentially what they do is, and they aimed at embedding deliberation, democratization, which includes stakeholder participation in the innovation process. And there have been a few examples that you can see on the right that are discussed in the paper around how responsible innovation has been used. But essentially it is to increase trust and to increase stakeholder participation in the management of new and emerging technologies. So if we take that concept and apply it, take the 4 principles of responsible innovation, which are anticipation, inclusion, reflexivity, and responsiveness, and apply it to the governance of EID systems, we in our paper have developed a framework that essentially looks at 6 areas. And these areas, as you can see, they start from the design and development of these systems and then move into operationalization, implementation, related aspects. But what we're trying to do with this framework is essentially, it's a principle-based approach to governing EID systems that supports the existing work that's happening in the field. It's supposed to be modular and non-prescriptive. It supports existing or in development governance models. And it can be also used to analyze existing EID governance practices and build solutions to address the gaps. So as I was saying, it's not meant to be a replacement of existing governance practices, but really to provide ideas to complement existing practices. So I can quickly walk through each one of these, but as you can see, there are 6 broad areas. The first one is around shared values development, and the aim really here is to reduce the information asymmetry between stakeholders. So this in many contexts is to improve the knowledge of what an EID system is meant to do and what it is not meant to do. What we've seen in a number of areas is there are a number of myths or concerns regarding these systems. And the creation of shared values enables that these myths are dispelled and that we can have a common starting point for the design and development of these systems. I've pointed out, and in this paper, we pointed out there are 3 types of interventions that can be done to help build shared values. The first is consultation, so get clarity on the goals and outcomes, and also gain feedback from the design of these systems or on the design of these systems. The second is around education, so specifically myth busting and giving users clarity on what their digital rights are. The third is consent, which is often a difficult area to get right, but consent, particularly with a focus to simplify what it means, reduce opacity of data management practices, and understand what recourse is available. So shared values development focuses on ensuring that stakeholders within an EID system understand the objectives and understand why a certain system is being deployed. The second area we've discussed is design imperatives. And the aim really here is to consider humanity in design and think about ethics of networked architectures, essentially to implement user considerations in design and implement for diversity rather than implementing based on a standard best practice. We know that design of EID systems tends to follow an engineering methodology when it's not just about the technology, but it's about designing for a program that takes into account local norms or local issues that may be faced during the development of an EID system. So value-sensitive design provides a framework for design, and we've elucidated this in the paper as well. But value-sensitive design is essentially a framework that goes beyond just economic imperatives. It brings direct and indirect stakeholder needs into the design process and brings clarity on their design needs and constraints. The purpose here isn't always to give the user needs primacy, but at least to bring them to the fore and talk about the value tensions that may exist within the system. The challenge, of course, here is that many organizations, be it government or private sector, have limited resources or incentives to carry out protracted value-sensitive design-like processes. But a big thing is to consider the design of the entire socio-technical system and not just of the technology. When we talk about multi-governance approach, or when we think about governance, it is often thought about as an imposed set of procedures. However, in our proposed framework, we appreciate the network nature of EID systems and also the vast number of stakeholders that are involved. So our proposal really aims to be relevant to the entire ecosystem. And we've given a few ideas on how different types of interventions, whether at a macro or a micro level, can be included it can be added as checkpoints while these systems are being deployed, designed, or governed. At a national or transnational level, there are different agreements that can be made or can be crucially analyzed, while at a micro level, it is maybe embedding social science researchers or providing ethical training to designers that allows to bring forth value tensions or the considerations of the users during the implementation of these systems. As I mentioned, we have talked about how EID systems aren't just technological systems, but they also have within them various organizational structures, techno-commercial arrangements that are often not transparent. So the aim here really is to provide clarity and transparency on these techno-commercial arrangements and organizational structures, and so really to address some key questions. So who are these systems built for? Who benefits from these systems? And which partners are involved? And how do they benefit? What risks are involved in the system? And who bears the risk? These are all relevant questions to consider within EID systems. Below, you can see some examples where in Nigeria in the Nigerian national ID system, they chose to partner with MasterCard, while it was unclear on what the commercial arrangement or what the benefits MasterCard would have from such an arrangement. Similarly, 23andMe, which is at the bottom right, is another unique case that houses digital and DNA data, aggregates this and shares it with commercial partners such as GlaxoSmithKline for their own monetary gain. So to understand these systems is to understand what these commercial arrangements are, who benefits from them, and who bears the risk of it. The next section is around autonomy and ownership of the online self. And here the aim is twofold, essentially. The first is to connect siloed data practices. So to connect, even within academia, we focus on the sociological persona management side and the data management side separately, but it's essentially to try and bridge the academic and practice divide we have there. And secondly, to provide greater control to the individual. We're already seeing some of these some of these examples come to bear. So data cooperatives offer an avenue to develop business models that exploit personal data responsibly, and an opportunity for minority communities to pool their resources and benefit from medical research. So it's an interesting example of data ownership that can be monetized. MeWe, again, is a social media platform that offers, at least claims to offer users greater control of their data. They claim not to track or monetize user content, and only align with partners that also sign up to their privacy imperatives. So essentially, privacy is being used as a competitive advantage here. There are also many unanswered questions in this space too. So we continually need to work through and merge the studies of data management and sociology to come up with ideas that meet people's and systems needs. And the final area in our framework has focused on inclusion, exclusion, and responsiveness to change. So EID technologies require means to monitor how they're impacting societies and adapting to reduce harms. Program impact assessments need to go beyond usual volume metrics of coverage and also consider three aspects. So the ethical, what we're calling the ethical, the experiential, and exclusionary dimensions. So ethical assessment should understand how target populations perceive the use of EID systems, if people understand their data rights, and how their identities are mediated. Experiential assessment should focus on understanding how users of ID systems how the ID systems affect human agency, and exclusionary assessment should monitor the participation levels of different population segments, and essentially based on this new data, change or modulate how these systems are being used. So I've covered quite a bit in this, but hopefully you get an idea of what our paper covers. So EID system governance essentially requires an approach that balances uncertainty and innovation, particularly given the global and national imperatives that it's aligned to. Responsible innovation provides an analytical framework to build innovations with care and responsiveness and bring stakeholders into the fore, essentially managing uncertainty through engagement and democratization. And this paper acknowledges the network nature of digital business models and seeks to improve social and economic outcomes for all stakeholders by using responsible innovation principles. So our proposed framework is principles-based as opposed to being very specific to a technology. And it's aimed at being modular and complementary to existing governance methods. The proposed framework can be used as an analytical tool to assess existing practices, identify gaps, and also areas for improvement. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your time.